The watch hit the counter with a sound like a gunshot, and Orion Briggs did not look away from the pharmacist's eyes when it landed. "That is a Hamilton Railroad watch," he said, his voice low and cracked from 3 days without proper sleep. 18-karat gold case. My father carried it through the war. You tell me what that buys." The pharmacist, a thin man named Gideon Cole who smelled of camphor and pipe tobacco, picked up the watch with 2 fingers as though it might burn him. He turned it over. He opened the case and read the inscription on the inside, EB to OB, 1871, and he set it back on the glass counter without expression. "It buys the laudanum," Cole said. "It buys the quinine. It might even buy the sulfur compound if you don't press me for change." "I am not pressing you for anything," Orion said. "Just the medicine. All of it." Outside, the town of Red Rock, Wyoming was buried under 14 inches of snow, and the temperature had not risen above 0 since the first week of January. It was now the 17th of February, 1883, and the winter had become the kind of legend that old men would tell about for the rest of their lives. The kind that took people. The kind that did not apologize. Orion Briggs walked out of that pharmacy with a brown paper package tucked under his arm like it was the most precious thing in the world, because it was. He climbed onto his horse, a big, stubborn gray roan named Colt, and he rode 6 miles through blinding wind and drifts that came up to the animal's chest. And when he finally pushed through the door of the small house at the edge of his property, he stood there for a long moment just listening. He could hear her breathing. It was shallow and rattling and wrong, but it was there. He crossed the room in 4 strides and knelt beside the cot where Lena Zarek lay with her dark hair plastered to her forehead by sweat and her lips the color of old ash, and he said the only thing he knew how to say by then. "I am here. I brought it. You are going to be fine." She did not open her eyes, but one corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more desperate than that. Something that looked like belief. He had not known 3 months earlier that he was capable of that kind of sacrifice. He had not known he was capable of most of what this winter had pulled out of him. But that was the thing about long winters and dark circumstances, and women who looked at you like you were worth something despite every piece of evidence to the contrary. They showed you who you actually were, whether you were ready to find out or not. It had started in October, before the first snow. Orion Briggs was 31 years old and had been running the Briggs Ranch alone since his father died in 1879. The ranch sat on 400 acres of high Wyoming grassland north of Red Rock, and in good years it produced enough beef and hay revenue to keep him comfortable, to pay his 2 hands, an older man named Sam Tully, and a young, quiet fellow from Nebraska named Percy Holt, and to set a little aside for repairs and lean seasons. In bad years, it produced enough to survive. He had not yet experienced a year that produced less than that, but he had prepared himself, the way his father had taught him, for the possibility. He was not a man who talked much. He was not a man who smiled easily or asked for help or admitted when something was harder than he expected. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone as the bluffs to the west of his property, and eyes the color of winter sky just before a storm rolled in gray-blue and very serious. The people of Red Rock respected him without particularly liking him. He paid his debts, kept his fences, and did not come into town unless he needed to. That was enough for most. What most people in Red Rock did not know was that Orion Briggs had not always been that contained. There had been a version of him, years ago, that laughed at dances and stayed too long at card tables, and once rode 40 miles in the wrong direction because a girl in Cheyenne had brown eyes and a good singing voice. That version of him had been burned away, gradually, by loss and work, and the particular loneliness of running a ranch that had belonged to someone you loved. He had made his peace with being alone. Or so he believed. Right up until the morning, he found the Zarek wagon stuck in the ravine off the north road with one wheel broken clean off its axle, and the occupants in no position to do anything about it themselves. It was mid-October, and the sky had that pewter color that meant weather was coming. Orion had been riding the fence line checking for brakes when he spotted the wagon below the ridge. He pulled Colt to a stop and looked down for a long moment before riding down, because he was not a man who rushed into other people's problems. What he found when he got there: one elderly man sitting against the wagon wheel with his leg at an angle that made Orion wince, a half-dozen crates of household goods shifted and broken, 2 draft horses standing patiently in their harness, and leaning over the old man with a strip torn from her petticoat and her dark eyes fierce with concentration, a young woman who did not even look up when Orion rode in. "His ankle is broken," she said, still not looking up. "Maybe worse. I need a board for a splint. Do you have rope on your saddle?" Orion dismounted. "I have rope." "Good, get it." He got it. The old man was named Joseph Zarek. He was 62 years old, a Polish immigrant who had spent 30 years in Pennsylvania mining coal, before deciding that the West was where he would spend whatever years remained to him. The young woman was his daughter, Lena, and she was 24 years old and had the kind of directness in her manner that most people in Wyoming in 1883 found either refreshing or deeply unsettling depending on their constitution. Orion found himself somewhere between the two. "Where are you headed?" he asked, while Lena tied off the splint with a knot that was better than anything he could have managed. "We have a homestead claim north of town," she said. "Quarter section. We filed in Cheyenne in August." "North of town," Orion repeated. He thought about this. "That would put you on the Caldwell parcel. Old man Caldwell's place. He abandoned it in 1880. We know. We bought the improvements from the county. The house needs work." "It needs a great deal more than work," Orion said, because he had ridden past the Caldwell place, and it was little more than a collapsed sod wall and a root cellar with a rotted door. He said this not to be cruel, but because he did not see the point in saying otherwise. Lena Zarek looked at him then for the first time fully, and the look was not hostile exactly, but it was measuring, like she was deciding something. "We know that too," she said. "We have tools and materials in the wagon. We plan to spend the last of autumn getting it livable before winter." "The last of autumn," Orion said, "is about 3 weeks. Then we had better get started." He helped them get the wagon out of the ravine. He rode into town with Joseph Zarek, draped carefully across Colt's back while Lena drove the repaired wagon. He had spare bolts in his saddlebag that happened to fit the axle, a coincidence she did not thank him for as much as he privately thought she might. And he found Doc Hennessy and arranged for Joseph to stay at the boarding house until the ankle was healed enough to work. He also, without quite deciding to, rode out to the Caldwell parcel the next morning to look at the state of it. He told himself this was practical. He told himself that a collapsed homestead this close to his own property line was a concern from a land management perspective. He told himself several things that were true, but were not the real reason. And the real reason was standing on top of the crumbled sod wall in the gray October morning air, looking out over the grassland with one hand shading her eyes, and she did not look like a woman who needed rescuing. She looked like a woman making a plan. "You are back," she said, not turning around. "I am checking my fence line," he said. It was not entirely a lie. The fence line was nearby. "Your fence line runs to the south," she said. "I walked the boundary markers yesterday." He looked at her for a moment. "The house is not going to hold," he said. "The wall on the north side has lost its structural integrity. The roof pitch has collapsed inward." She turned around then and looked at him, and there was something in her face that was not defeat but was adjacent to it, something that acknowledged the size of the problem while refusing to be broken by it. "I know," she said, "but there is a root cellar and the chimney is intact. If I can get the north wall shored up and some kind of roof frame over the main room, it will hold through winter." "It will not," he said. "Mr. Briggs, Orion Briggs." "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I understand that you have looked at this house for 30 seconds and reached a conclusion. I have been looking at it since yesterday morning. I appreciate your assessment. Now, unless you are offering to help, I would ask you to let me work." He should have ridden away. That was what the logical, self-contained, solitary version of him would have done. He had his own ranch to run, his own work, his own well-established understanding that getting involved in other people's situations led nowhere good. Instead, he tied Colt to a fence post and picked up a shovel. They did not talk much during that first day of work, which suited them both. Orion could see that Lena Zarek was the kind of person who thought while she worked, who used silence the way other people used conversation, as a form of presence rather than absence. He found this comfortable in a way he had not expected. Most people who spent time with Orion felt obligated to fill the quiet. She did not. By afternoon, he had shored up the north wall with timber from the back of her wagon, good lumber, he noticed, bought carefully and with knowledge of what was needed. And she had gotten the chimney cleaned and drawing properly, and had started measuring for the roof frame. They worked until the light failed, and then Lena built a fire in the outdoor cooking ring she had set up near the root cellar entrance, and she made a pot of bean soup from stores in a tin box, and she handed him a bowl without asking whether he wanted one. He ate it. It was good. He said so. She looked faintly surprised, as though she had not expected him to volunteer an opinion, and then she looked back at the fire and said, "My mother taught me. She died when I was 15. He said, "My father taught me most of what I know. He died 4 years ago." Neither of them said anything more about it. But something had shifted, the way things shift in the early stages of understanding another person, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a kind of quiet, irreversible certainty. He came back the next day, and the day after. He told Sam Tully that he was helping a neighbor with some structural work, which was true. And he told Percy Holt to handle the morning cattle check, which Percy was capable of doing. And he did not tell either of them that he woke up earlier than he needed to in order to be at the Caldwell parcel by first light. He did not examine this too closely. Joseph came out from town at the end of the first week, his ankle splinted and his crutch carved by one of the men at the boarding house, and he shook Orion's hand with both of his own and said, "You are a good man." My daughter does not say so because she does not say things easily, but she thinks so. Joseph's English was careful and accented and entirely precise. Lena's was cleaner. She had gone to school in Pennsylvania, he learned, and had 2 years of teaching certificates before she had agreed to come west with her father because he could not make the journey alone. She could have stayed, Joseph said one afternoon, sitting on an upturned crate and watching Orion hammer rafters while Lena hauled timber. "I told her, she is young, she has her certificates, but she said," he paused, smiling at something. "She said that she was tired of living in the place where things used to be possible and wanted to go to the place where things were becoming possible. She read that somewhere. She reads everything." Orion looked down from the roof frame at Lena, who was walking back toward the house with 2 lengths of timber across her shoulders, her dark hair pulled back and her cheeks red from the cold. She caught him looking. She did not look away. Neither did he, for a moment longer than was strictly neutral. He hammered the next nail with perhaps more force than necessary. By the end of October, the house was not comfortable, but it was sound. Joseph was improving and could move without the crutch now, and he had taken on a small but steady wage helping the blacksmith in town while his ankle finished healing, which kept him occupied and kept money coming in. Lena had taken in 2 students for private tutoring, the Greer children, whose parents could not afford to lose the school fees, and she rode into town 3 afternoons a week on a borrowed bay horse. Orion noticed when she did not come to town. He also noticed when she did. He tried not to think about this too much and failed comprehensively. The first snow came on the 6th of November, which was early but not catastrophic. He rode over to the Zarek place to make sure the roof was holding and to bring a quarter of beef that he told himself was because he had too much and it would go to waste, and Lena said, "You do not have too much beef. You run a cattle operation." But she took it, and she made a stew that night that he stayed too long eating because Joseph asked him questions about the history of the territory. And Lena sat across the table, reading by lamplight with the focused stillness of someone who could block out everything when she chose to. She was wearing a dark blue dress that he had not seen before. He noticed this and hated himself for noticing it. "You have enough wood?" he asked when he finally stood to leave. "We have enough," she said, not looking up from her book. "The winter looks to be a hard one." "Thank you, Mr. Briggs, Orion." She did look up then. A pause. "Thank you, Orion." He rode home in the dark and the cold and told himself with complete conviction that he was not falling in love with Lena Zarek. He was being neighborly. He was fulfilling an obligation he had invented for himself out of geographic proximity and basic decency. He was absolutely, categorically, not falling in love with anyone. He had been telling himself variations of this for 3 years, ever since a woman in Cheyenne had accepted another man's proposal while Orion was still working up to asking the question. He had taken that as a sign that he was not the kind of man women chose, and he had rebuilt himself accordingly. Harder, simpler, less available to wanting things he could not control. He had not factored in the possibility of Lena Zarek. The second snow came in the last week of November and did not stop for 4 days. When it finally cleared, red rock was under 2 feet, and the temperature had plummeted to something that turned the air into a physical substance, something you had to push through rather than breathe. Orion had seen hard winters, but this one had a quality to it that he recognized from his father's worst stories. A settled, permanent cold that did not intend to lift. He spent 3 days getting his cattle to the lower pasture shelter and making sure his hay stores were properly positioned. And on the 4th day, he rode out to check on the Zareks because he told himself he was checking on all his neighbors, which would have been more convincing if he had checked on any of the others. Joseph answered the door and said, come in, Lena is not well." Orion stopped in the doorway. "Not well," he repeated. "She has had a cough since last week. I told her to rest. She does not rest." Joseph said this with the tone of a man who had been saying it for 24 years and was no longer surprised by the results. Lena was at the table, pale but upright, writing something in a notebook. She looked up when Orion came in, and the look on her face was the particular irritation of someone who does not enjoy being seen in a diminished state. "I am fine," she said. The cough came a moment later, deep and rattling, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and waited for it to pass, and Orion could hear in it something he did not like at all. "How long?" he asked Joseph, keeping his voice even. 8 days. Joseph said quietly, which was 3 more than Joseph had indicated. Lena set down her pen. "I have had coughs before," she said. "This winter is cold and dry. Everyone in town has a cough. Not like that, Orion said. She looked at him steadily. You are not a doctor. No, he agreed. I am not. But my mother had a cough like that and he stopped. The room was very quiet. I am sorry, Lena said, and she said it simply and without any softening performance, just the directness of someone who understood loss and did not dress it up. I will bring Doc Hennessy tomorrow, Orion said. That is not necessary. I am bringing him. She opened her mouth. He looked at her, not harshly, but with a steadiness that said he was not negotiating this particular point. And after a moment she closed her mouth again and looked at her notebook, and what passed across her face in that second was something he had not seen there before. Something softer. Something that might, in a different light, have been gratitude. Doc Hennessy rode out the next morning and listened to her chest for a long time, and then told Joseph privately, in the front yard with the snow coming down again, that it was not consumption, a word they had all been not saying, but it was a serious bronchial condition that had been made significantly worse by the cold, the work, and the fact that she had been treating it with sheer willpower for nearly 2 weeks instead of rest and medication. She needs quinine and something for the inflammation, Hennessy said. She needs to stay warm and she needs to rest. Truly rest, not the kind where she keeps a book in her hand. He paused. And she needs to avoid cold air as much as possible, which in this particular winter is going to be the challenge. Orion bought the first round of medicine himself and brought it that afternoon without telling her he had paid for it. He told her it was from the doctor's supply and that Hennessy had said not to worry about the cost until spring. This was not true, but it was a manageable lie and he was not going to apologize for it. She took the medicine. She did not rest exactly the way Hennessy had defined it, but she did stop doing heavy outdoor work, which was something. Joseph took over the wood carrying and the livestock feeding. They had 2 goats and a pair of chickens in the barn, not much, but enough to require daily care. And Orion came every other day with small things. A bag of coal for the stove, an extra blanket from his storage, a bottle of good broth that Sam Tully made better than anyone, which Orion brought in a sealed jar and said was left over from his own kitchen, which Sam Tully would have found very amusing if he had known Orion was claiming his labor as his own. December arrived and the cold deepened. The pass to the north closed entirely, which meant the supply wagons from Cheyenne could not get through, which meant that Red Rock began to run low on certain goods. The pharmacist, Gideon Cole, started rationing his stock. What had been available freely in November became expensive by Christmas, and was running thin by the middle of January. Lena improved slightly through December, and then worsened again when the temperature dropped to 20 below in the first week of January and stayed there. The bronchial condition had settled deep and her body, which had not been given adequate time to fully recover, was struggling to fight it. Joseph was frightened in a way he could not quite conceal, and Orion could read it in the older man's face every time he came to the door. Orion did not show that he was frightened. He was, comprehensively, but showing it would not help and might make things worse for her, and so he kept his voice even and practical, and did what needed doing. He and Joseph had a conversation at the end of January that neither of them would have acknowledged as the conversation it was. They stood in the yard while Lena slept inside, and Joseph said quietly, "She is going to need more medicine, the kind that Cole has at his pharmacy. The good quinine compound and something stronger for the cough. Cole quoted me a price last week that he stopped. I do not have it. I spent most of what we had on the lumber in October and the supplies for winter. I had wages from the blacksmith until the cold closed the shop. I have perhaps $11. Orion said. How much does Cole need? Joseph told him. It was more than $11. It was more than Orion had in ready cash, because he had already extended most of his liquid savings on the winter feed supplies he had purchased on credit from the grain merchant. His cattle were his wealth, but you could not sell cattle in the middle of February in a Wyoming winter when the ground was frozen solid and no buyer could get to you. He went home and stood in his bedroom and opened the box where he kept the watch. He had been carrying the Hamilton since his father pressed it into his hands on the day he died, in the spring of 1879, with the words, "You know what to spend it on and what not to. I trust you to know the difference." He had taken those words seriously. He had carried the watch through 4 years of drought worry and cattle losses and roof repairs and fence replacements, and he had never considered selling it, because it was the only thing his father had left him that was irreplaceable. He sat on the edge of his bed and held it for a long time. He thought about Lena Zarek lying on her cot with her breathing rattling and her lips that color and her dark eyes, when they were open, still holding that particular quality of alertness and presence and stubborn refusal to surrender. He thought about the way she had handed him a bowl of soup without asking. He thought about the blue dress and the humming and the way she looked at the grassland like she owned the sky above it. He thought about sitting beside her on the wagon bench for 6 miles and 6 miles back, and how the silence between them had been the most comfortable silence he had known since his father died. He thought about his father's voice saying, "I trust you to know the difference." He closed his hand around the watch. The next morning, in the gray early light with the temperature at -15, and the wind cutting across the flat land like a blade, he saddled Colt and rode to town. He came back 6 miles through drifts that came up to the horse's chest with a brown paper package of medicine under his arm, and he pushed through the door of Lena's house and knelt beside her cot with snow still on his coat, and he said the only thing he knew how to say. He did not tell her about the watch. Not then. He was not sure he was going to tell her at all. Joseph knew. Orion had told him outside the pharmacy briefly before he went in, because Joseph had offered to come with him and Orion had said he would handle it. When he came out, Joseph had looked at the package and at Orion's empty wrist. He had always worn the watch chain, and Joseph had not said anything. He had put his hand briefly on Orion's arm and then dropped it, and they had walked to the horses in silence, which was the only proper response to what had just happened. Lena, when she was able to speak properly, which took several more days, asked him what he had done with his watch chain because she had noticed it was gone. She noticed things. It was one of the qualities he had observed in her from the beginning. She was attentive to detail in a way that most people were not, and the absence of the watch chain on a man who had worn it every single day since October was not going to escape her. He told her he had put the watch away for the winter. He said he was worried about losing it in the snow. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that were beginning to be clearer now, less glassy, more like herself. "That is not the real reason," she said. "It is a reason," he said. She did not push it, but he could see that she was turning something over in her mind. She started to recover more substantially in the last week of February. The quinine was working. The sulfur compound was helping clear what the cold had settled in her chest. Doc Hennessy came out twice more, and each time said that she was doing better than he had any right to expect given the conditions, which Hennessy attributed to the medication, and Orion attributed to sheer determination, and the fact that Lena Zarek simply did not accept losing as an option. March arrived and brought with it a slight softening of the temperature. Still well below what anyone would call comfortable, but no longer the brutal sustained negative that had characterized January and February. The supply wagon from Cheyenne got through on the 12th of March, and the town felt it like a collective exhale. Lena was up and moving by the second week of March, not fully herself, but close enough that she was impossible to keep still. She insisted on walking the property line. She insisted on reading to her 2 students, who had been coming to her house since the weather made the road to town difficult. She sat at the table for longer each day, her color slowly returning, her breathing clearing. Joseph watched her with the relieved, exhausted love of a parent who has been terrified for months and is only beginning to believe the danger has passed. Orion watched her with something more complicated and more urgent, and by March, something he was no longer making any real effort to deny to himself. It happened on a Thursday, the 15th of March, when the temperature had risen enough that the snow on the south-facing slope of the roof was beginning to melt and drip steadily from the eaves. Joseph had gone into town, the blacksmith shop had reopened, and he was back at his wages, and Orion had come by to check on the structural integrity of the barn, because one of the roof supports had been concerning him since the heavy snowfall. He fixed the support. He was in the barn doing this when Lena appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, the first she had been able to make since the supply wagon came through, and she held one out to him and said, "You sold the watch." He did not stop working for a moment. Then he put down the hammer. "Joseph told you," he said. Joseph did not say a word, she said. "But I know what happened, Orion. I have known for weeks. I just needed to feel well enough to say it to you." He took the coffee. He did not know what to do with his face, which was doing something he was not accustomed to managing. "It was the practical solution," he said. "The watch was an asset. You needed medicine. The calculation was straightforward." "That watch was your father's," she said. "Yes." "You have never sold anything that belonged to him in 4 years of running this ranch alone." He was quiet. "That is not a practical calculation," she said. "That is something else." He looked at her. She was standing in the barn doorway with the pale March light behind her, still thinner than she had been in October, still with the traces of weeks of illness in the shadows around her eyes. But she was there. She was standing upright and looking at him with those dark eyes, and saying out loud what he had not been ready to say to himself. "I did not want you to die," he said. It came out more simply and more completely than anything he had planned to say, if he had planned to say anything, which he had not. "Orion," she said. "I am aware that we have known each other since October," he said, the words coming now in a way he could not quite stop, the way things come when you have held them a long time and something finally opens. "You came every other day for 4 months, she said. "You brought coal and broth and medicine, and you did not make me feel like a burden even once. You let me be angry and difficult, and I know that I am not easy, and you did not seem to mind." "I did not mind," he said honestly. "I noticed the watch chain was gone the 3rd day you came after," she said. "I have been thinking about it ever since, about what kind of man does that and says nothing about it, says it is practical." "I did not want your gratitude," he said quietly. "I wanted—" He stopped. "What did you want?" she asked. He set down the coffee cup. He looked at her, really looked, the way he had been careful not to look for months because looking meant wanting and wanting meant the possibility of loss. "I wanted you to stay alive long enough for me to tell you that you are the most remarkable person I have met in my entire adult life, and that I have not been able to think about anything except you since October, and that I am too old and too set in my ways and too thoroughly convinced of my own inability to say the right thing, but I would very much like to try." The barn was quiet. Somewhere in the back, one of the goats made a small, unimpressed sound. Lena Zarek looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she set down her own cup. "You are 31 years old," she said. "That is not too old. And you just said exactly the right thing." And she kissed him. It was not the most graceful moment in either of their lives. He had forgotten what to do with his hands for a terrible second, and she had to reach up to close the distance because he was taller than made sense. But it was very real, and it was warm, and it was the kind of thing that, once it happens, completely reorders everything that came before it and everything that comes after. He put his arms around her finally, with the enormous relief of a man who has been holding something back for so long that releasing it feels like setting down a weight he had forgotten he was carrying. And she leaned into him with a kind of deliberate, unhurried certainty, like someone who has thought this through and is satisfied with the conclusion. Joseph came home that evening and found them at the table together, not particularly close in their positioning, but with a quality of ease between them that had not been there before, a kind of settled mutual awareness. And Joseph looked at this for approximately 3 seconds, said "good," and went to put the kettle on, and that was the entirety of the discussion. April came and the winter broke properly at last. The snow receded in stages, revealing a grassland that was sodden and battered but alive underneath, the way things are that have been pressed under ice for months and find their way back regardless. The cattle on Orion's range were thin, but had come through. The Zarek goats were thriving with an energy that seemed almost vindictive given what the winter had done to everything else. Orion and Lena spent a great deal of April working on her house again, this time with the addition of a second room. She had the plans drawn from January, she told him, and had spent the bedridden weeks measuring twice in her head so she would not have to measure twice with the tape. And he discovered during this work that their rhythm together, which had been comfortable before, had become something better than comfortable. It had become easy in the specific way that things are easy when two people understand each other without needing to explain themselves at every turn. She disagreed with him about roof angles. She was right, as it turned out. He acknowledged this without enormous difficulty, which surprised him. She said he was the first man she had met who could be corrected without treating it as a personal assault. "My father corrected me constantly," he said. "He said if you could not hear the correction, you could not learn the work." "I think I would have liked your father," she said. "He would have liked you," Orion said. "He had very little patience for people who could not think, and you are the most clear-thinking person I know." She looked up from the plans. Something moved across her face that was pleased and a little surprised, like she had not entirely expected that. "Thank you," she said. "It is a fact," he said. "I am not given to compliments for their own sake." "I know," she said. "That is exactly why it means something." He asked her to marry him at the beginning of May, which in retrospect he might have timed with more ceremony, because they were in the middle of planting the kitchen garden, and he was on his knees in the dirt already, which she found funnier than was strictly flattering. She laughed, genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh he had been waiting months to hear from her and which was everything he had hoped. And then she said yes with the same direct certainty she brought to every decision she made, as though she had already considered all possible answers, and this was the only one that held up. Joseph cried. He was not apologetic about it. He sat at the table and wept openly, and said that her mother would have been very happy, and that he himself was the happiest man in Wyoming Territory, and possibly in the entire United States, which was a strong claim, but no one in the room was going to argue with him about it. They were married on the 14th of June, 1883, in Red Rock, in the small white church at the end of the main street that the Methodists had built in 1878. The ceremony was attended by roughly half the town, which was more than Orion had expected, and slightly more than Lena had wanted, but which she accepted with the grace of someone who understood that communities require participation. Sam Tully and Percy Holt stood with Orion. Doc Hennessy and his wife sat in the front row. The Greer children, who were Lena's students and had decided they were deeply invested in this outcome, had made a wreath of early wildflowers that they presented to her before the ceremony with enormous solemnity. Lena wore a dress of pale ivory that she and the dressmaker had assembled in 3 weeks using fabric from the general store, and a pattern that she had designed herself, adapting it from a fashion plate she had brought from Pennsylvania. She did not look like a conventional bride exactly. She was too self-possessed for that, too clearly present in the specific space of herself. But she was beautiful in the way of things that are entirely genuine, and when she walked down the aisle toward Orion and he saw her coming, what crossed his face was something that everyone in the room could read clearly, even the people who had always found him difficult to read. He looked like a man who knew exactly how fortunate he was. The Reverend asked him if he took this woman, and he said, "I do," with a conviction that made the Reverend pause and smile before he continued. The Reverend asked Lena the same question, and she said, "I do," in the same voice she used for every important statement, clear and even and completely sure. And Orion took her hands in his, and the rings went on, and the Reverend said the words that made it official, and Orion kissed his wife in front of God and the Methodists of Red Rock, Wyoming, and the Greer children wept with a theatrical intensity that was frankly impressive. The summer was the opposite of the winter in every way, warm and golden and full of work that felt different from solitary work, because it was shared. Lena moved into the Briggs ranch house, which was larger and better established than the Zarek homestead, and Joseph stayed on at the Zarek property, which they maintained as a secondary holding, and which he improved steadily through the warm months with the particular focused energy of a man who has survived something and intends to live well in its aftermath. Lena found she was expecting by late September. She told Orion in the kitchen in the morning over coffee, with the same directness she brought to every significant communication. She said, "I believe I am with child. I want you to know that I intend to keep working until I cannot, and that I expect you to manage any concern you have about this without trying to wrap me in cotton." He set down his cup. He looked at her for a long moment with something that was moving behind his serious gray-blue eyes. Then he said, "I am going to worry anyway. Can we agree on that? You can worry internally," she said, "as long as you do not express it by trying to prevent me from doing things I am capable of doing." "Agreed," he said. And then, because he was not a man who said certain things easily and he had learned that not saying them was its own kind of mistake, "Lena, I am very happy." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "So am I," she said. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was cold but not vicious, nothing like the winter that had come before it, and Orion took a private, irrational satisfaction in this, as though the previous winter had used up its quota of cruelty and been sobered by the result. Joseph spent that winter with them at the ranch house, because the practical concerns of Lena's advancing pregnancy were something that required additional hands, and because Joseph, who had been lonely in ways he did not discuss, was visibly made whole by the noise and warmth of a full house. Their son was born in April of 1884, on a morning when the first green was coming up through the brown grass, and the creek at the south end of the property was running fast and loud with snowmelt. Doc Hennessy delivered him with his usual calm competence and announced him healthy at the top of his lungs, which was an announcement the boy seemed to agree with, given the volume he achieved. They named him Edward Joseph Briggs. Edward for Orion's father, E.B. The inscription had read to O.B. And Joseph for the grandfather who sat in the corner chair with his hands clasped and his eyes shining and who held the baby first, by Lena's deliberate arrangement, because she wanted that moment to exist, and she was not sentimental about admitting what she wanted. Orion held his son and sat in the chair beside Lena's bed and did not say anything for a long while, and she watched his face with the particular attention she paid to things that mattered. And what she saw there was the specific quality of happiness that belongs to people who have known real loss and real fear, and who understand, from the inside, what the alternative looks like. "Edward," he said quietly to the baby, who blinked at him with the unfocused, solemn attention of the very new, "I will try to be as good a father to you as he was to me." "You will be better," Lena said, "because you will have me to tell you when you are wrong." He looked up at her. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was everything adjacent to one, and she had learned by now to read it as the thing it was. "That is a comfort," he said. "I know," she said. Summer came again, generous and long. The ranch prospered in ways that Orion had hoped for but not counted on. The cattle herd expanded. The hay yield was exceptional, and a contract with the Army Supply Depot in Cheyenne that Sam Tully had helped negotiate brought in revenue that allowed Orion to make several improvements he had been deferring for years. A new barn, a repaired root cellar, a second water trough by the south pasture. Lena had resumed tutoring by August, taking on 4 students now, the Greer children and 2 others from families that could not make the school fees. And she had begun writing letters to the Territorial Education Board about the establishment of a proper school in Red Rock. Letters that were precise and well argued, and that the board, after initial resistance, found difficult to dismiss. She did not tell Orion she was writing these letters until she had already sent several of them. He found out when the territorial superintendent wrote back, and Lena read him the letter at the breakfast table with the expression of someone who has anticipated this response and is moderately satisfied but not surprised. "You have been conducting a campaign," he said. "Yes," she said, without mentioning it. "I did not want you to discourage me before I had enough momentum to resist discouragement," she said. He considered this. "I would not have discouraged you. You would have asked practical questions that might have felt discouraging even if they were not intended as such," she said. "I know how you think." He opened his mouth, closed it. "That is probably accurate," he admitted. The school was established by the following spring. A proper, board-certified schoolhouse, the first in Red Rock, funded jointly by the territory, and a small property tax that the town debated with enthusiasm for 3 months before passing by a margin that surprised even the supporters. The school teacher hired was a young woman from Colorado, a Miss Abernathy, who arrived in April of 1885 with a crate of books and a serious expression, and immediately impressed everyone including Lena, which was not an easy thing to do. Lena threw herself into the establishment of the school's library with the focused energy of someone who has been planning this privately for years, which she had been. Joseph built the bookshelves himself. He had become a remarkably good carpenter over the previous 2 years, surprising everyone including himself. And by the time the school opened in September of 1885, the shelves held over 200 volumes, assembled from donations and purchases, and 3 separate letters to publishers in New York that Lena had written with the same precision she brought to everything. Edward, at 18 months, was unimpressed by the library but very taken with the wooden horse Sam Tully had carved for him, which he carried everywhere and which he periodically offered to adults as a gift, and then immediately reclaimed. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes and the temperament of someone who had not yet decided whether the world was trustworthy, which his parents found both understandable and faintly alarming. Percy Holt, who had been quietly in love with the youngest Greer daughter, Clara, 19 and sharp as a tack since the previous year, proposed to her in the summer of 1885 and was accepted. And the Briggs Ranch acquired the particular festive quality of a place where things are going well and people are happy, which is not a quality that lends itself to description exactly, but which is entirely recognizable when you are inside it. "You owe me $11 in retrospective savings," Lena told Orion, who had been standing beside her when Sam made this remark. "I will add it to the debt," he said. "What debt?" she said. "The one you have been accumulating since October of 1882, he said. "The debt of all the things you have done for this ranch and this family that I have no currency to repay." She looked at him, that direct, measuring look that he had loved from the very first time she turned it on him in the ravine, when she asked him for his rope without looking up. "You sold your father's watch," she said simply. "That is not a debt," he said. "That is the easiest decision I ever made." She was quiet for a moment. Around them the reception continued, lanterns swaying, people talking, the sound of someone's fiddle starting up near the barn. "I want to find it," she said. He looked at her. "What? The watch? I have been thinking about it for 2 years. I want to find it and buy it back." "Lena, Gideon Cole still has it," she said. "I asked him last month. He has been keeping it. He said that he expected someone would come for it eventually." She paused. "I have been saving money since February. The tutoring fees, I have enough." He stared at her. The fiddle had started a real tune now, something fast and celebratory, and in the yard the guests were beginning to move toward the dancing. "You have been saving your tutoring fees," he said. "Yes." "To buy the watch." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her face, which held its usual self-possessed expression, but with something underneath it that was careful and private and offered to him specifically. The way she offered things that mattered, directly, without pretense or excessive decoration. Just the thing itself. "That is your money," he said. "It is yours. You do not need to do that." "I know I do not need to," she said. "I want to. There is a difference." She reached into the small bag she wore at her wrist. She had worn it to the wedding and brought out a cloth pouch that she placed in his hand. "Cole is opening tomorrow morning," she said. "I already arranged it." He held the pouch. Inside he could feel the weight of coins, more than he had expected, which told him how many weeks of tutoring fees she had redirected to this purpose, how long she had been doing this without telling him. He thought about her sitting at the table in the evenings with the small ledger book she kept, adding and subtracting with the precision of someone for whom numbers were a form of order in an uncertain world. He thought about October, the wagon in the ravine, the rope, the bowl of soup, the blue dress, the long winter and the rattling cough and the 6 miles through chest-deep snow and the pharmacy counter and the watch landing with the sound of a gunshot. "Lena," he said. "Yes," she said. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known." She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes and the expression that was not quite a smile but was everything surrounding one. "You said that already. In October of 1882, more or less." "I am saying it again," he said, "because it remains true and I intend to keep saying it." "Annually would be sufficient," she said. "I am planning on more frequently than annually." She leaned up and kissed him on the cheek, brief and specific, in front of all the guests and the lanterns and the fiddle player and Sam Tully, who saw it and was quietly, completely satisfied by what it meant. They went to Cole's pharmacy the next morning together, the 3 of them, Lena and Orion and Joseph, who had heard what was happening and announced at breakfast that he intended to be present, which was not negotiable. Gideon Cole, who was not a sentimental man by nature, had the watch already out and placed in a small wooden box on the counter, which suggested that the arrangement of it had some ceremony to it that Cole was not going to acknowledge directly. Lena counted out the coins, exactly. She had not miscounted. Gideon Cole took them and set them aside and did not count them because he had trusted her arithmetic from the first time she had dealt with him, and he saw no reason to start doubting it now. He pushed the box across the counter. Orion opened it. The Hamilton lay inside exactly as he remembered, the case with the faint marks of years of use, the weight of it precise and familiar. He opened the case and read the inscription, and it said what it had always said, EB to OB, 1871. He closed the case. He put it in his pocket. Joseph blew his nose loudly and said he had something in his eye. Gideon Cole went to examine a shelf of very interesting remedies in the back of the shop. Lena stood beside Orion and did not say anything, which was the correct thing. Orion put his arm around her, and they stood there for a moment in the quiet pharmacy, with the morning light coming through the window and the cold outside, and Joseph recovering his dignity. And somewhere far to the north, the mountains still white with the snow of the previous year that the summer had not finished clearing. "Thank you," he said quietly, not performing it, just saying it. "You would have done the same," she said. "I did do it first," he pointed out. "We are even then," she said. "We are nothing like even," he said, "but I appreciate the generosity of the framing." She laughed, that full, real laugh, the one he had been waiting for in the barn in March of 1883, and had been making happen as often as possible ever since. Joseph said from the back of the shop, "Are we going to breakfast or not?" They went to breakfast. Life on the Briggs Ranch settled into the specific, good fullness of a life that has been built deliberately by people who know what they want and are not afraid of the work. The years that followed the terrible winter of 1882 to 1883 were better ones, not without difficulty, because Wyoming in the 1880s was not without difficulty, and the cattle industry had its reversals, and the weather had its moments, and the land required constant tending, but better in the way of things that are done well and done together. Lena's school campaign bore further fruit in 1886, when the territory approved a county education fund that supported 3 new schools in the Red Rock district, a development that the superintendent attributed in his official report to the persistent and well-documented advocacy of certain community members, naming no names but including a letter of acknowledgement to Mrs. Lena Briggs that she kept folded in the same box where Orion kept the Hamilton watch. Edward, 2½, regarded his new sister with the critical and searching attention of someone who has been the sole occupant of a territory and has received news of a new settler. He did not commit to an opinion for several days and then appeared to reach one, because he began bringing her the wooden horse in the mornings, setting it next to her with great solemnity, and this was understood by everyone in the household as the equivalent of a formal welcome. Joseph, at 66, was healthy and occupied and had recently begun teaching wood carving to a small group of men at the boarding house who had asked him to, which had become one of those unexpected second-act pleasures that a life sometimes offers if you live long enough into it. He carved a cradle for Margaret that was the finest thing anyone in Ridge Rock had seen outside of a catalog photograph, with small decorative details on the headboard that included a tiny horse for Edward, and a tiny open book for Lena, and a tiny mountain range for the view from the ranch. And Lena put her hand on her father's arm when she saw it and said nothing for a moment, which was how she expressed things that were too large for words. The summer of 1887 was golden in the way of Wyoming summers that remember their obligation to compensate for the winters. The cattle herd was the best it had been since Orion's father had run it. The hay yield was remarkable, and the supply contracts had expanded to include 2 additional buyers. Orion hired a third hand, a quiet, reliable man named Thomas Crane, who came with good references from a ranch outside Laramie. And the operation had reached a scale that his father would have recognized as achievement. Percy and Clara Holt had a son of their own in the spring of 1887, a round and shouting child named George, and the two families had the kind of close-knit, mutually supportive relationship that was the actual social fabric of the West when it worked the way it was supposed to. Not the romance of lone independence that the newspaper stories preferred, but the real, practical, daily fact of people who needed each other and knew it. She had a book in her hands, as she nearly always did in quiet moments, and he had coffee and was watching the sky change, which he had done since childhood, and which still held something he could not reduce to a simpler emotion than gratitude. "You ever regret it?" she asked without looking up from the book. He knew what she meant without asking. They had gotten to the point of knowing that. "No," he said, "not even on the bad days. There have been bad days. Not even then," he said. "The watch came back. Everything else that matters is still here." She did look up then. The sky was burning copper and violet above the ridgeline, and the light was on her face, which was a face he knew as well as the land he had worked for 30 years, and which was, in its way, equally essential to him. She was 29 now, and 5 years of Wyoming living had put the particular quality of outdoor sun and hard work into her complexion, and she looked more like herself than she had in the pharmacy in October of 1882, more fully present in the life she had chosen, and she was. He thought this every day, if only briefly, because he was not a man who narrated his interior at length. She was the best thing that had ever happened to him. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her, the particular way she had said it. "Another one," he said. She smiled, a full smile, not the almost smile but the real one, the one that still did something to his chest that he could not explain in straightforward terms. "Another one," she confirmed. He set down the coffee. He reached over and took her hand, which she allowed, leaning her head slightly against his shoulder in the way she had gradually, over years, permitted herself to be easy, the woman who did not accept help easily, who did not ask for things she thought she could manage alone, who had learned by degrees that accepting was not weakness, that wanting was not shameful, that being loved by someone who saw her clearly was not a debt to be repaid. "When?" he said. "Spring," she said. Above them, the sky finished its transformation and settled into the deep blue of summer evening, and the first stars appeared over the ridge, and the sounds of the ranch at night, cattle settling, horses in the near pasture, the distant voice of the creek, arranged themselves around them like the specific music of a life that had been built right. Joseph came out the next morning and was told, and he sat down at the kitchen table and did not cry this time. He said he was conserving his tears for the important occasions. But he held Lena's hand for a long moment with both of his and said in Polish, something that Lena translated afterward for Orion, "Your mother would have loved this life. She would have loved to see you in it." The third child was a boy, born in the first week of April 1888, when the snow was still on the mountains but the lower pasture was coming green, and the crocuses Lena had planted along the south side of the house, the previous fall, were pushing up through the last frost with the vindicated certainty of things that know the cold is not permanent. They named him William Thomas Briggs. William for no one in particular, except that it was a name they both liked, and that sounded right when paired with Edward and Margaret. And Thomas for no one either, just a strong name that suited the large and vocal child who had arrived with the clear intention of being noticed. He was noticed. He made sure of it. Edward, 4 years old and now the possessor of a considered opinion on most subjects, inspected his new brother with the same critical attention he had applied to Margaret, decided more rapidly this time, and handed him the wooden horse. This was apparently a permanent and unconditional transfer, because Edward had by then progressed to a carved wooden rifle, Sam Tully's work again, and had moved on from horses as his primary interest. Margaret, who had by 14 months developed a personality that was her mother in miniature, observed all of this with calm, bright-eyed attention. E.B. to O.B. 1871. He had thought, sometimes, about what to do with it eventually, about what the next inscription might be. He had not said any of this aloud because he was not entirely sure yet how to say it, but he had thought about handing it one day to Edward, the way his father had handed it to him, with some version of the same words. You know what to spend it on and what not to. I trust you to know the difference. And maybe by then Edward would understand, the way Orion had come to understand, that spending it was not losing it. That the things you give away in love don't diminish, they multiply. That the watch had been given for Lena and had come back and now held in its small gold case not just E.B. to O.B., but the whole accumulated weight of everything that had followed. The winter and the pharmacy counter and the barn in March and the wedding in June and the children and the school and the porch and the summer sky and the life that had been built from a decision that everyone would have called impractical. And that had been, in fact, the most practical thing he had ever done. Lena looked up from the baby and found him in the doorway. "Come in," she said. "Stop standing in the doorway." "I was thinking," he said. "You can think inside the room," she said. He came in. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned against him, very slightly, with the baby between them and the children around them and Joseph quietly magnificent in the corner chair. And outside the window, the April morning was coming up gold over the ridgeline, and the creek was running and the cattle were starting their morning movement toward the water, and the whole living, complicated, beautiful thing of it was going on without pause, the way it did, the way it would. "Orion," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would do it all again," she said. "Every winter, every hard thing." He turned his head and looked at her. "Even the part where you almost died," he said, because they had reached the point where they could say even that directly. "Even that," she said. "Because this is where it led." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father used to say that you know the value of a thing by what you are willing to give up for it." "What are you willing to give up?" she asked, not testing him, just asking. The way she asked things, like she genuinely wanted to know the answer, he thought about it. About the watch. About the 6 miles through the chest-deep snow. About the entire winter and what it had cost and what it had given back with interest. "Nothing I would not give again," he said. "Nothing that matters more than this." She put her hand over his where the watch was in his pocket, and she pressed lightly, just for a moment. An acknowledgement, a complete one. Outside, Wyoming in the spring of 1888 was going about its business, indifferent to the particular happiness of any one ranch or any one family. The way land is indifferent, the way seasons are, the way the cold had been indifferent to Lena Zarek, lying on her cot in February of 1883. The mountains did not care about people's stories. The creek did not remember the winter or the watch or the 6 miles or the pharmacy counter. But inside that room, in the specific and irreducible gravity of it, everything was held. Everything was accounted for. The morning continued. The light changed. The baby slept. Margaret climbed down from her grandfather's knee with business of her own to attend to. Edward went to the window and looked seriously out at the pasture and announced, in the voice of someone making an official report, that there was a fox in the yard. There was indeed a fox in the yard. It sat by the garden fence and looked at the house with the self-possessed interest of something that is not afraid and has its own ideas about what belongs to whom. Lena looked at it through the window from the bed. "That fox has been coming around since March," she said. I think it has decided we are part of its territory. The feeling is mutual, Orion said.